It's not often that I find myself very interested in strictly turn-based games, but if I had to mention one major exception, it would probably be Microprose and Mythos Games' 1994 extraterrestrial invasion simulator Xcom UFO Defense. UFO Defense is also known by a confusing myriad of other names due to some slightly problematic renaming during localization, which definitely isn't made any more convenient by Firaxis' 2012 reboot, just sort of hijacking the original European subtitle as well as the entirety of the European PlayStation 1 version's title. For the sake of simplicity, I'll just refer to the old one by its North American subtitle, and the rest of the games by their respective subtitles, which also seems to be what most others are doing when addressing the series. I also need to state that despite Altar's UFO series never having been an official part of the Xcom franchise, I find both difficult to fully separate from each other. Until the release of Enemy Unknown, I always saw the games in the UFO series as some of the newest iterations on the Xcom formula, so you'll likely hear me talk about them as if they were indeed part of the Xcom franchise. You could say that their only resemblances are due to the genres, but then again, when the genre itself only spans like two extremely similar franchises and a couple of highly iterative spin-offs, they all really might as well just be one series. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get started. There seems to exist a consensus that management and strategy makes for poor horror, but the difficulties of successfully making resource management and strategy optimizing viable for emotional investment means that classical strategy, let alone turn-based strategy, can't create scares or tension. If my blatant assumption about this consensus actually existing holds up, then UFO Defense seems to be the biggest insult to that idea that I'm aware of. Its graphical style is saturated with a cheesy B-movie strangeness, which both is as distancing as it is characteristic, like the weird hair it is for male units, its cartoonish intro, as well as its other cinematics which border on grinding completely against the atmosphere evoked in the rest of the game. But what it succeeds at so much is mood. I already feel like I'm probably going to be saying this a lot in these videos. As many excellent strategy games which exist today, there aren't a whole lot that use their mechanics to evoke the kind of unease present in the aforementioned title. The early enemies might be the same archetypical small big-headed men as seen in most first contact sci-fi pop culture, and to be honest, all of the UFOpedia art of the aliens is really cheesy, but their presence becomes a whole lot more unnerving when your squad is caught in a dark suburban neighborhood at night, with poor visual feedback limited to the line of sight of units, no prior knowledge of the position of the enemies or the layout of the area, and with the ever-present knowledge of enemies being at least slightly more dangerous than your own soldiers. Advancing is made dangerous by the possibility of soldiers walking into the line of sight of enemies, potentially triggering reaction fire, but the moment when movement is interrupted by a little flashing warning and a subtle dark figure in the peripheral of the revealed map can be equally stressful, especially if that dark figure happened to show up in a position that the player wasn't prepared for. It's also made much more unnerving when the game's low resolution and use of contrast makes the in-game graphics look as gritty as this. It's not unlikely that the heavily zoomed in view helps provide anxiety as well, but just like the resolution, it obviously didn't carry over to later installments, largely due to practical reasons. It's an interesting notion though that a few of the qualities which greatly helped contributing to the atmosphere found in UFO Defense and Terror from the Deep, as well as maybe Apocalypse, are tied in with design decisions which came about largely as a result of the technology available at the time, and as such would never really make any practical sense to continue using in the following installments. Making use of a higher resolution to provide more options for graphical design, a less spacious user interface, and a larger view of the environment should be a net benefit to a game such as this. But a common problem in pretty much all later installments of the series is that the cleaner look brought about by the higher resolution and the lack of any unnerving graphical style to compensate means that the graphics fail to convey any sense of dread. The only real exception I can think of is UFO Aftermath, which despite some serious flaws at least had some pretty interesting ideas for environments and enemy designs. The mutated, sometimes undead creatures and the brownish post-apocalyptic environments created by the biomass are interesting in their own right, and even if car crabs and skeletal bird things might be a little silly in notation, the design is actually fairly memorable in practice if little else. Much worse off are the later UFO Aftershock, UFO Afterlight, and Firaxis' Xcom Enemy Unknown and Xcom 2. And all of those awake to clean texturing and the stylized cartoon models make units look like some of the worst possible parts of youth-oriented superhero cartoons. It's extremely difficult to feel threatened and equally difficult to feel awe when aliens and humans alike look like something straight out of Ben 10. The most pronounced and probably also the funniest example is the design of the Viper in Xcom 2. The moderate sexualization at play has resulted in it becoming a subject of Rule 34, especially among furry artists, which turns it into a strong antithesis to any truly disturbing alien life form.
Stay back! Back! What is it?
Instead of being disturbing by way of being unrelatable and unfamiliar, it instead looks relatable and familiar enough to be considered sexually attractive by a fairly large audience. At least Xenonauts managed to maintain some appeal in its graphical design by taking after the aesthetic of Army Handbook illustrations from the era it takes place in, that is, 1979, but even there the point still stands that certain parts of the aesthetic design are hampering its ability to probably convey dread. Sound design is one of the facets which carried over to the later titles slightly more intact. The shift from ad-lib to these electronic/orchestral soundtracks isn't elegant in all of its incarnations, but that definitely doesn't mean that at least a couple of the Geoscape themes in the UFO series aren't memorable. Most of the music tracks in UFO Defense itself are much more ambient than many other action soundtracks of the time, and only the sound of footsteps, doors opening, and the UI are heard frequently in missions, occasionally punctuated by loud gunshots, and some of the most blood-curdling death screams I've heard in any game, period. The sound effects of the UFO series, and definitely also Enemy Unknown, may not be quite as memorable, but there at least aren't any severe problems except for maybe one thing. It's a bit strange that this consistent demand arose that the player's units should be voiced, especially considering that it's never really used for anything but mildly flavoring radio chatter. It was probably a result of a more general trend going on at that time, but voice acting has always been costly to produce, and there are just so many cases where it's utilized with little to no benefit whatsoever, like here. In practice, the limitations of what voicing can be produced, especially when it's in English and the developer is located in Czechia, like with Alta, mean that not only are the available voice presets in the early UFO games so scarce that several soldiers are likely going to end up with the same voices anyways, some of them are downright horrendously acted.
Your orders, sir.
Now what?
Enemy spotted.
Requesting orders, sir.
The presence of the voice lines remained in the later titles of the UFO series, as well as Enemy Unknown and Xcom 2, always with a slight hint of cheese to it that just really doesn't hammer home the mood at all.
I'm still having a hard time grasping what it is the aliens are hoping to accomplish here. Are they studying us? Why abduct humans seemingly at random?
Another strange trend which for some reason also took over in the UFO series and Enemy Unknown, as well as the unofficial fan game UFO Alien Invasion, is a much reduced squad size. I was originally going to keep this pretty short, but oh god, it turned out to be a pretty big deal. It's not totally unpredictable that this change would eventually become the norm for the series. Commanding a 12-man squad in a turn-based isometric strategy game takes time, especially when each unit has to be individually ordered around, and this is just the starting squad size in UFO Defense. Once you get the Avenger, which can carry a max of 26 soldiers, finishing just one turn during missions is downright tedious. But the massive squad size also provides a very tangible reward for the investment of time and resources required in order to acquire this sort of endgame technology in the first place. You may start out with a small SWAT team of sorts, but you eventually end up with a small army, complete with armored vehicles and multiple other specialized units. If you don't like ordering them all around, there's always the option to just not make use of all the space, or alternately spending most of it on tanks instead of soldiers, since they take up more space. It's definitely nice to at least have the choice. So cutting the squad size is good for creating much faster pacing, but this comes at the expense of several things which were always bound to upset the people who appreciated the simulationistic aspects of combat and management in UFO defense. Because simulationistic combat mechanics need to be flat out ditched in favor of heavily abstracted combat mechanics if you want to make a minority force to be the more viable force in a non-stealth game. In the UFO series, units were for the most part made extremely bullet spongy in order to balance the 4 to 7 man teams against the in some levels overwhelming amount of enemies. In Enemy Unknown, the main problem that I kept facing was that while a lot of superpower perks were added to the rank system of units to make them viable against the now far outnumbering amounts of enemies, the base stats now seemed to be slightly worse than that of a rookie in UFO defense, something that was made even worse by the fact that there are barely anyone left to cover up for a soldier who misses a vital shot or otherwise blows their turn while standing in a vulnerable position. So basically, your squad members in Enemy Unknown are as vulnerable as they were in UFO defense, but you now have a starting squad size 1/3 of your starting squad size in UFO defense, and a max squad size at half of that. So you can't allow them to be vulnerable, but in order for them not to be vulnerable, you need to either invest in perk points which grants them superpowers, or alternatively give them better equipment, but in order for them to gain perk points and in order to get better equipment, you need them to complete missions without dying, which requires you to not allow them to be vulnerable. I tried so many times playing on classic difficulty Iron Man mode to get to the point where my unit started to perform decent, and always I suffered crippling casualties after like 4 to 5 missions. The dreaded Portent mission, which at least according to the internet is bugged and therefore unintentionally difficult, ended up being the straw that broke the camel's back on every single one of my runs. When I finally admitted defeat and turned the difficulty down, I suddenly found myself playing the UFO games all over again. A painfully slow grind through mission upon mission with barely any challenge whatsoever set a very low standard compared to the intense mixed frustration and tension I felt while playing on classic difficulty. When the game finally started to ramp up in challenge, it was only due to a mixture of me getting accustomed to playing in the most uninspired, methodic way possible, and enemies starting to get bullet spongy and surviving rifle fire from units standing on the tile next to them. I'd like to add the observation that I was likely playing like shit and not exhausting enough of the strategic opportunities I had. That's a recurring issue when I'm playing strategy games, but reading about the suggested tactics to be used on classic difficulty and harder, it seems like the way to play probably isn't much less methodical and inane than my own playstyle. Due to the game considering enemies as non-existent at the beginning of missions until they've been spotted by your units, and because your squad needs to be able to deal out an amount of damage that low-level troops seems to be almost incapable of just to stay alive, playing defensively is vastly incentivized. If you treat your squad like an assault squad and have them move around offensively, you're likely just going to end up creating your own death trap. It's not unlikely that this is the main reason as to why I'm so piss poor at this game, despite having played through most others in this genre or series or whatever with far fewer problems. Judging from the strategy suggestions that I found, the way to complete missions that I was missing is the way which just involves cheesing the system as much as possible. Activate enemies by running into their line of sight, retreat to somewhere where they can't see you, activate Overwatch, wait, and hope that your squad hits when the enemies enter the line of sight. That's neither simulationistic nor does it effectively build tension. It is, however, thematically detrimental to the experience. It doesn't really feel like you're defending Earth against aliens as much as it feels like commanding a turn-based strategy variant of the Left 4 Dead survivors. I've seen the argument that units allow for easier emotional attachment when there's fewer of them, since it has a greater mechanical impact if one of them die thrown around quite a bit, but in my experiences it mostly just had the opposite effect. After seeing average low-ranking soldiers missing the far majority of their shots, get critically hit while in heavy cover, and generally be performing like shit, the only emotions they evoked were intense feelings of resentment and frustration. Why were their grenade throwing skills pinpoint accurate when they couldn't hit shit with their rifles? Why did they miss about 4 out of 5 shots when their chance to hit was 40%? Why their animations looked so cartoonishly superhuman? Why should I spend time customizing them and giving them slightly less ugly uniforms if they were going to die almost immediately anyways? Why didn't someone in the Xcom management think of maybe using a larger transporter craft? The attachment to units doesn't come from them having vital roles in your team as much as it comes from the experiences that the player has with them as the game goes on. If those experiences all consist of incompetent soldiers being the biggest possible hindrance towards victory, it starts to feel like casualties are deserved and that disempowerment is caused by RNG, a lack of soldiers and a lack of viable strategies, rather than the player's own lacking abilities. Despite it probably being the biggest cause. I actually found Xenonauts to have the much more powerful systems for creating emotional attachment to soldiers without the need for the ability to make them wear hot pink or give them all full names. Soldiers are generated with roughly the same properties as those in UFO defense. They have a name and ethnicity, a set of RPG-esque values determining their combat abilities. And on a side note, wow, they actually look like human beings. But with the addition of nationalities, a usually but definitely not always unique character sprite, previous combat regiments and previous combat experiences. These are further helped by user-generated modifications, adding to the amount of sprites and underrepresented nationalities that the game can use to generate units with. Since Xenonauts takes place during the late Cold War, and since soldiers are recruited internationally from the various military forces of that time, you can have soldiers from West and East Germany, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, as well as most other industrialized countries with substantial military forces. The amount of semi-random properties combined is enough to let soldiers pass as individual entities without any real need for customization on the player's part or for below mediocre repetitive voice lines.
That's nothing to worry about.
UFO Afterlight also pulled off a pretty interesting move by having the roster of people able to fight in combat and perform research and manual labor on the Mars base an almost fixed value, allowing them to exist fully as individuals, with their own voices and their own appearances, as well as forcing the player to respect their value because they just aren't easily replaceable. It also had several other really interesting ideas among its mechanical shortcomings, but maybe I'll make a video about that sometime in the future. Understanding how to create horror in a genre which contains extremely distinguishing elements, like an overhead view and a heavy emphasis on manipulating semi-random variables, can be extremely advantageous if done right, and this is where the horror elements of UFO defense come into play on a mechanical level. It doesn't have the jump scares or other scripted spectacles of Resident Evil, but it does have the uncertainty and the very deliberate pacing of some other very respectable works of horror. You know those scenes in horror cinema, sometimes preludes to jump scares, where the protagonists are forced to enter a dangerous area, and they advance slowly, carefully, breathing heavily, drenched in sweat, looking around, the fear visible in their eyes, ready to jump at the slightest sound or movement. The same feelings which are evoked by the cinematography, the sound, and the imagery displayed in those scenes are evoked mechanically in UFO defense by the limited line of sight, mixed with the semi-random layout of missions. Essentially every mission plays out like its own self-contained miniature horror narrative, with shocks and tensions growing as the player's assault team starts to dwindle in numbers and the situation becomes more pressing. Enemies can end up surprising the player through reaction fire or by standing in corners and dark alleyways. This is why the player's units are allowed to outnumber their enemies in some missions. It's balanced out by the asymmetrical information structure and further balanced by an asymmetrical technology structure. The player's human soldiers are frail and can always be killed by a lucky headshot, but most of their equipment is upgradable and they can be supported by extremely destructive armored vehicles. It's definitely not as stressful to fight a couple of disorganized crew members at a UFO crash site as it is to try and establish control over a terror site, but you're still the one who has to pay for the new recruits to replace your fallen soldiers if you manage to get a couple of rookies killed trying to clear a small crash site. Plus, every soldier lost means one less battle-hardened veteran to benefit from combat experience. Experience which over time increases important stats and turns rookies at least slightly more useful. It's very possible to lose about half of your fighting force in the notorious terror site missions, and thus it's up to you, the player, to judge if the casualties suffered are acceptable in the long run. The opportunity to abuse the save system is there, but in my case the pain of having to replay particularly lengthy missions actually outweighed that of just dealing with serious casualties, so I can't really say that it imbalances the game as much as it does in many other games. There's much less of this management aspect to Enemy Unknown. It's much more difficult to win a mission with any casualties when the squad isn't large enough to be able to take anything but the slightest retaliation, and it's almost impossible to re-establish your position if you lose the one team which had the benefit of whatever experience could be gained in the first couple of easy missions before the game becomes serious. So I just developed a zero tolerance policy for losing any missions whatsoever. Maybe the vast majority of times I rage quit or restarted were situations which could be salvaged, but it usually didn't seem likely by any stretch of the imagination. Once again, that mostly just reminds me of the UFO series, where squad members weren't expendable because rookies were useless, and there also just weren't really any reason as to why you'd need to sacrifice them in the first place, except for maybe if you just forgot to save for a long time. If someone goes berserk and shoots a squad mate while standing in a bad spot, you've basically already lost unless it happened with 3 enemies or less remaining, and have fun trying to train up a rookie or two to take their spot in the team afterwards. In UFO defense and xenonauts, it's usually just a much more moderate setback, which allows for close-shave victories and soldiers redeeming themselves in pressing situations. A soldier getting a lucky shot managing to kill off an alien about to attack a comrade or a civilian is suddenly that much more admirable. The 3 soldiers who survive a particularly bad terror site mission are suddenly heroes who you'd want to keep alive further on. In Xenonauts, this is further reinforced with the addition of medals, which are awarded to units for different feats in combat. With continuous stat tracking, every soldier is allowed its own identity and its own miniature narrative as the game progresses, a narrative which is shaped mostly by how well the player manages their troops. This is how emotional attachment is fostered. Maybe I don't remember most of the time I've spent playing Xenonauts, but I do remember Polish machine gunner Boris, whatever, I don't remember his last name, with glasses and brown short hair, who become one of my leading veterans in one of my longer playthroughs. The many casualties endured and the diversity of the individuals fighting the alien threat ultimately serves as the basis of some extremely interesting points in the series. That the struggle for humanity's survival in its darkest hours, or years here, is a struggle of internationalism, one that all countries participate in and support until the point where it becomes politically impossible. That the struggle is one which is fought by people of varying ethnicities and skills, and the more ethnicities the games represent, the better. That the alien invasion brings disturbing amounts of tragedy, but simultaneously causes a ridiculous leap in humanity's technological development. And in addition to all this, the simulationistic elements of tactics and management included in the series teach the player to manage their troops in a way that seems believable, at least within the limitations of the games. Anyways, I've been talking a lot of shit about Enemy Unknown now, but if I honestly thought it was shit, I probably wouldn't have bothered to write so much about it. For a long time, the continuous frustrations and rage quitting endured during my very imperfect attempts at playing it on classic Iron Man was always followed up by another attempt. A sort of intense engagement, fueled by the desire to just do at least slightly better, that I haven't really felt playing any other titles in recent times, because it just had to be possible when so many people thought that the higher difficulties were reasonable enough. Right? Well, I haven't found out the answer yet, but it's not totally unlikely that I'll try sometime again in the future. Or maybe I'll check out Xcom 2 once it starts seriously dropping in price. The most likely unintentional neglect of those previously mentioned thematic and aesthetic design elements definitely makes the newest games less attractive to someone like me. But hey, it's still good fun. And at any rate, I still believe that whatever could have come out of the formula established by Laser Squad and UFO Defense could easily have been far, far worse.